Welcome one final time to Book 4 of the Gay Science. Today we're going to finish this marvelous book, and with it the main text of the Gay Science, as Book 5 was added much later. And as I've already sort of reviewed the ideas, recapitulated many of the ideas of the book, the main points of the book, we've sort of done that as we've gone. I'm not going to do so here at the beginning, except to reiterate that the conclusion of Book 4 is widely considered to be the beginning of Nietzsche's mature philosophy, as it's usually called. So we can see his naturalist period give way, so to speak, to his affirmative philosophy over the course of the Gay Science. And by the end of our reading today, we'll have covered, in this text alone, most of the big ideas of Nietzsche: the death of God, the eternal recurrence, amor fati, the critique of metaphysics and morals, and of course, the appearance of Zarathustra. So let's begin with 328. Quote, "To harm stupidity. Surely the faith preached so stubbornly and with so much conviction that egoism is reprehensible has, on the whole, harmed egoism, while benefiting, as I shall repeat 100 times, the herd instincts, above all by depriving egoism of its good conscience, and bidding us to find in it the true source of all unhappiness. Your selfishness is the misfortune of your life. That was preached for thousands of years, and harmed, as I have said, selfishness, and deprived it of much spirit, much cheerfulness, much sensitivity, much beauty. It made selfishness stupid and ugly and poisoned it. The ancient philosophers taught that the main source of misfortune was something very different. Beginning with Socrates, these thinkers never wearied of preaching, your thoughtlessness and stupidity, the way you live according to the rule, your submission to your neighbor's opinion, is the reason why you so rarely achieve happiness. We thinkers, as thinkers, are the happiest of all. Let us not decide here whether this sermon against stupidity had better reasons on its side than did the sermon against selfishness. What is certain, however, is that it deprives stupidity of its good conscience. These philosophers harmed stupidity." End quote. So the preachments against selfishness actually harmed selfishness, just as the philosophical figures, beginning with Socrates, of all people, actually harmed stupidity. And by implication, there is a correlation with the herd morality and stupidity in this passage, insofar as herd morality, as we've already established in past aphorisms, is actually antithetical to thinking. You might say morals in general are antithetical to thinking, which is a very strange thought, but it's a sub-theme of the Gay Science, that thinking itself requires transgression of moral boundaries, in the sense that true thinking is experimental, and it has to be not artificially limited and circumscribed if it is to be genuine, if it is to be called thinking. The reason why Nietzsche praises his old enemy, Socrates, in this passage. Remember, in his very first book, Nietzsche attacks Socrates. So the reason why he praises him here is that Socrates does precisely what the Christian moralists have done in the opposite direction. They say you ought to look to the rule, to the opinion of your neighbors, for how you ought to live. Socrates says you ought not to look to the rules and to the opinions of your neighbors. Your goal should be the pursuit of truth. And remember, for Socrates, the pursuit of truth is the way to the good life, because the good life is the virtuous life. And as Nietzsche says elsewhere in, I believe, Twilight of Idols, the Socratic formula is reason equals virtue equals happiness. And Nietzsche says this is the strangest formulation he's ever seen, or one of the weirdest he's ever seen, and that it surely must have appeared the same way, as just as weird, to the Hellenic Greeks. We've spent a great deal of time discussing Nietzsche's position on Socrates throughout the years, and I've considered the many negative statements that he makes regarding him, primarily that Socrates is the herald of a theoretical age, the imposition of a rational ideal upon human life, which gives rise eventually to an overly intellectual and artistically bereft society, and ultimately signals the beginning of the decline of the Greeks, as Nietzsche says. But here, Nietzsche is saying that Socrates challenged the stupidity which is always widespread when men subject themselves unthinkingly to the rule or to the received wisdom. They check their thoughts against the opinion of the majority, we might say. And perhaps one way of putting it is that they think out of a desire for that mutual recognition of the broader community, as Hegel might have put it. The Socratic dialogue is an attempt at an incision, an intervention against thought as something inherited or given or simply reproduced by consensus. The philosophical project, beginning with Socrates, is, in a sense, the desire to make an experiment of every truth which we believe to be pre-established, to subject it to questioning, to falsification. And this is why I have also spent a similar amount of time comparing Nietzsche to Socrates as a figure who in many ways adopts the Socratic model, the gadfly, the fencing master, and perhaps most importantly, the decadent who comes along to hasten the decline. Nietzsche says that by critiquing decadence, one does not slow it down. They actually hasten the decadence by criticizing it. And that therefore all critics of decadence actually serve the function of exacerbating it in some way. But isn't that exactly what Nietzsche himself does? Does he not come and challenge our stupidity, ask us why we identify ourselves with these thoughts which we have received from the modern age? Now, of course, one could argue that the church, the preachers against egoism, have more effectively harmed selfishness than the philosophers have ever harmed stupidity. They have more control over what the conscience says. And part of the dynamic here is that the Christian morality itself being a herd morality, that's proof of the fact that Socrates' attempt to give a bad conscience to stupidity doesn't work. Or maybe the method of Socrates, the philosophical method, is the kind of thing that can only work for a few people or a few types of people. You might gather a few followers that way, but for the majority, the herd impulses will keep them on the side of the rules, we might say, on the side of the herd morality. So in order to truly give a bad conscience to stupidity on the grand scale, on the same scale at which the Christian church combats the selfishness of the individual in the name of the community at large, one would have to approach the same issue, not philosophically, but perhaps religiously. Perhaps it would actually require a new set of myths. Perhaps it might require a new prophet. Let's go to a longer section. This is 329. Quote, "Leisure and idleness. There is something of the American Indians, something of the ferocity peculiar to the Indian blood in the American lust for gold and the breathless haste with which they work. The distinctive vice of the New World is already beginning to infect old Europe with its ferocity and is spreading a lack of spirituality like a blanket. Even now, one is ashamed of resting, and prolonged reflection almost gives people a bad conscience. One thinks with a watch in one's hand, even as one eats one's midday meal while reading the latest news of the stock market. One lives as if one always might miss out on something. Rather do anything than nothing. This principle, too, is merely a string to throttle all culture and good taste. Just as all forms are visibly perishing by the haste of the workers, the feeling for form itself, the ear and eye for the melody of movements are also perishing. The proof of this may be found in the universal demand for gross obviousness and all those situations in which human beings wish to be honest with one another for once, in their associations with friends, women, relatives, children, teachers, pupils, leaders, and princes. One no longer has time or energy for ceremonies, for being obliging in an indirect way, for esprit in conversation, and for any otium at all." End quote. Otium is leisure. Back to the text. Quote, "Living in a constant chase after gain compels people to expend their spirit to the point of exhaustion in continual pretense and overreaching and anticipating others. Virtue has come to consist of doing something in less time than someone else. Hours in which honesty is permitted have become rare, and when they arrive, one is tired and does not only want to let oneself go, but actually wishes to stretch out as long and wide and ungainly as one happens to be. This is how people now write letters, and the style and spirit of letters will always be the true sign of the times. If sociability and the arts still offer any delight, it is the kind of delight that slaves, weary of their work, devise for themselves. how frugal our educated and uneducated people have become regarding joy, how they are becoming increasingly suspicious of all joy. More and more work enlists all good conscience on its side. The desire for joy already calls itself a need to recuperate and is beginning to be ashamed of itself. One owes it to one's health. That is what people say when they are caught on an excursion into the country. Soon, we may well reach the point where people can no longer give in to the desire for a vita contemplativa, that is, taking a walk with ideas and friends, without self-contempt and a bad conscience. Well, formerly it was the other way around. It was work that was afflicted with the bad conscience. A person of good family used to conceal the fact that he was working, if need compelled him to work. Slaves used to work, oppressed by the feeling that they were doing something contemptible. Doing itself was contemptible. Nobility and honor are attached solely to otium and bellum. That was the ancient prejudice, end quote. So, as Nietzsche leaves off there at the end of the passage, leisure and warfare, those were the marks of nobility. And Nietzsche has written about this ancient valuation many times. I think it's one of the keys to unlock that dichotomy between Dionysus and the crucified, or between the Hellenic world and the modern world. In many respects, though certainly not every respect, the Hellene has a completely inverse set of moral valuations from our own in the modern age. Nietzsche says in Homer's Contest that the Greeks had no concept of the dignity of labor, that they thought that to work was shameful, even to work to produce artistic masterpieces like great sculptures. This was considered shameful since one was thought to be temporarily taken over or possessed by the muse, who's effectively using you as a laborer, as her slave. And so Nietzsche says, he has this very funny line where he says, the artists of the ancient world, or of ancient Greece, were proud of their works, but ashamed of the work that produced them. The way that those of the Christian morality are proud and eager to speak of their children, but embarrassed, ashamed to speak of the act of procreation. But we might even look to the Old Testament, or like the book of Genesis, wherein, what is the need to work in some of our oldest religious texts? The need to work as an agricultural laborer, by the sweat of your brow shall you eat bread. This is presented as a curse on mankind. It's part of God's judgment against us. So even in that religious morality, which is quite opposite to the Greeks, labor is still seen as perhaps necessary, but not as a good. It's a curse upon us. To the extent that it can be a good, it can be a good perhaps as an expiation of sin, but it is a punishment, right? So it's very different from how some Christians today talk about work as an ennobling thing, or again as something that imparts dignity. I think a lot of that might come from the Protestant or the puritanical sort of work ethic that took root in America, but more on that in a little bit. So how can we understand the mindset? First, what I want to do is really get into the mindset of bellum and otium, or what is, as Nietzsche says, attached, nobility and honor attached solely to otium and bellum. How can we understand this? So he would define that as the innocent barbarism of earlier times. That's why he often compares the Greeks of this period to tigers, or calls them tiger-like men. We could imagine people living in this age as perhaps more akin to a pack of predatory animals. Like we might imagine a pack of predatory animals that dominates a feeding ground. Their only concerns are to hunt their prey and enjoy their leisure. Such beings wouldn't have a care for being productive, being industrious, or contributing to society, whatever that might mean. In short, while it's completely understandable that within our modern morality, we might reject such a way of life, right, from our perspective. But even a person with the most modern of morality would have to acknowledge that this felt need to be productive, this good conscience around labor, this idea that it's like a moral duty to spend your days contributing or making or doing, as Nietzsche says, or reaping and sowing in the literal sense. That's not an innate desire of human beings. It's a mindset that emerges, first of all, in an agrarian society, and it's a mindset that emerges among those who are forced to labor, for whom labor is a necessity. Those who have to labor to survive come to glorify it, or at least see it as a necessary evil and perhaps even the expiation of sin. Like they recognize how, frankly, laboring sucks, but look, this must be in some way atoning for the sins of the original curse on mankind, the original sin, right? So they come to call idleness a form of evil. And by the way, this was a very strongly held belief in the Middle Ages. Foucault discusses this briefly in Madness and Civilization, that trying to explain why the people of the Middle Ages would attempt to use hard labor as a cure for insanity, why they would think it had curative properties, and furthermore, why they thought insanity itself was a moral failing. It's in part because it makes you idle, it makes you non-productive, and therefore perhaps what they need is to be made productive, to be forced to labor, to do the hardest labor possible. Perhaps that could be a cure for mental illness. Like, it seems like a very strange idea to the modern mind, but within this mindset of the Middle Ages, it makes some sense. So, given everything we've discussed throughout this book so far, it should be clear that Nietzsche doesn't think there's an absolute objective value to idleness any more than to industriousness. How could that be? Whether we value one or the other, that has to do with our own philosophical and moral justification for our way of life, our own sun that shines just for us, as Nietzsche puts it earlier. And so those who are forced to work eventually see the dignity in work or the necessity in it. Those who are freed from the necessity of work extol the value of leisure. And Nietzsche is trying to determine, it's like, again, that Dionysus versus the crucified contrast is very important, because when you compare the Hellenic values to the modern values and you find that they are opposite, it immediately, if you're not just within the traditional religious mindset of like, yeah, they were evil and our morality is better, right? If that's not the way that you view things, then it immediately raises a question when you perceive the antipodes of this moral earth of two opposite poles, two opposite perspectives. And the other thing I want to bring in here is the fact that otium is paired with bellum, right? Because we could say that it's because they're practitioners of the art of war that they earn the right to indulge themselves in leisure. Otium was originally enjoyed by the very few, who parasitized off of the labor of those beneath them in the social hierarchy. Now we are engaged in modernity in this project of leveling the social hierarchy. So what does that mean? Does that mean that the right to leisure will be equally distributed? Or perhaps it could mean instead the obligation to labor will be equally distributed. And it could even be perhaps both. And we could say in America, it's a little bit of both. And there are certainly visionaries for either side, right? I mean, Marxism has always involved from the beginning this notion of everyone being a laborer, but that's justified now that he owns his share of the means of production. So presumably there will also be equal leisure time. We also have other modern, perhaps like hyper-capitalist ideas, such as the transition to a universal basic income, the idea that eventually we'll be able to just like pay people out of the surplus of technology's abundance, effectively distributing leisure time to all and slackening the need to labor overall. Now, Nietzsche in this passage, he actually doesn't very much concern himself with the political dimensions of this question, as he does in some other places, the leveling political movements and the ensuing fate of leisure. That is a very important question for Nietzsche, but here he's concerned with the values. What values are we promoting, and which values are guiding us? Where do they come from? What is their power? Why are they felt to be a necessity? And Nietzsche makes this almost certainly dubious claim that the modern industrious haste is an indirect effect of the values and the way of life of the American Indian and their effect on the American settlers in the New World, perhaps. He says that they have a ferocity and a kind of haste with which they work. And this is somehow, it became infused into the culture of the United States, and this culture is now exercising its influence over all Europe. Now, I don't know where Nietzsche is getting this exactly, this description of the Native Americans. It actually makes very little sense to me, even as a stereotype. And I have no way to prove this exactly, but my first thought, I'll just tell you my first instinct that first came to mind when contemplating this, is that This is the opposite of how Jean-Jacques Rousseau describes the American Indians. Rousseau, of course, does not use the term noble savage, but basically says that the way of life practiced by the American Indians is far superior to the way of life practiced by Europeans, and that their civilization, European civilization, has not made us more free, but more enslaved. And one of the things he emphasizes about the state of nature is the amount of otium that one would get to enjoy there. That's one of the, we might say, the fantastical promises of those who wish for a return to nature, that life in the state of nature is more relaxed. You have to work, but far less than you do now, right? And it's not the same kind of work, really. It's that bellum and otium life, really, right? Of the pack of predators, of the hunter, of the, person who controls a feeding ground. So Rousseau opposes the Hobbesian view that life in the state of nature is solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short. Rousseau thinks the opposite. He thinks man has a natural pity that he will express and live out in this sort of circumstances, natural compassion, a natural amount of leisure time, and so on. And so I wonder if Nietzsche is saying that the haste and industriousness and the endless distractions of the latest news and the stock exchange and so on, I wonder if the motivation for this, saying that this is actually genealogically descended from the culture of Native Americans, is perhaps intended as a rebuke to Rousseau, who would think that these two ways of life are totally opposite one another, right? And part of Nietzsche's sort of twist on his view of nature that is similar to Rousseau's in some ways would be that society as it exists now is actually not separate from the state of nature, that the state is an objectivation of instinct, that everything that is contained within the state is just a rarefaction of what already exists in nature. And so this would seem to map onto this kind of claim here. It's also funny because Robert Pirsig also puts forward the theory in his book Leela that many of the traits that Europeans attributed to Americans in the early days of America, the stereotypes that they had about Americans are very similar to the traits and stereotypes attributed by the Anglo-Americans to the American Indians. So Pirsig suggests that the archetype of the lone gunslinger in the Old West has a great deal of the Indian brave in him, we might say. It's kind of syncretism or fusion. And you might say, well, the Amerindians were a conquered people. Why would that be? Well, it's not really that uncommon. I mean, think about Alexander the Great becoming enamored with Persia after conquering it, beginning to dress in their garb and partake of their cultural practices. So that aspect of it is interesting, that America today does perhaps take some cultural values from the Native Americans, maybe even in ways we're not aware of. But I don't agree that what they took was a sense of haste and industriousness. That sounds a bit ridiculous to me. I would agree with Rousseau, at least up to that point. I agree with him on very few things, but that would be one of the things I agree with him on, that the Native Americans were more leisure-oriented. They were more warlike, too, though, than the average liberal progressive image of them that we usually receive today. They actually were, in a real sense, perhaps the old style of fighting aristocracy, on the just on the tribal level, right? That's this kind of aristocracy that Nietzsche lauded. And he actually does come out and say this. There's a passage in his previous book, Daybreak, where he's describing, it's in the context of saying that there was a power of Christianity to permit men to commit inhuman acts with a good conscience. And I went and found that section where Nietzsche says, quote, burning Jews, heretics, and good books, and exterminating entire cultures superior to ours, such as those of Peru and Mexico, end quote. So, I guess this is all kind of a digression, but if you're just wondering how Nietzsche thinks about the Native Americans, he doesn't have really a strictly positive or negative view. It's very sparse, his comments on it, and you can kind of find some conflicting things. He makes some questionable claims here, or he makes one questionable claim here, and I suspect it's because he was trying to be a foil to Rousseau. But regardless of all of that, the second part of what he's claiming, that America has a certain industrious haste to it, that it has imbued upon the whole of European culture, I think he's correct about that. And again, it's not as a political regime especially not at this time. America's not even it's definitely not the most important country in Western civilization during this time, but it's a cultural export, even in the time of the late 1800s. Nietzsche is very consistently against reading the newspaper. He's against the newspaper as a cultural institution. And, we moderns would say, well, we need to read the newspaper, right? Especially if you're like a businessman or a politician or a stock trader, you have to keep abreast of the news of the day or the news of the hour even. You want news up to the minute, right? And Nietzsche would say that's precisely the thing that keeps you tethered to these momentary concerns. The overwhelmingly economic way of life that he basically says America adopts and then saddles Europe with this way of life keeps you constantly with timely concerns. And so that's what it means to live life as a homo economicus. So his concern here is not so much with socialism, which is capitalism's shadow, as we might understand it, but with capitalism itself, or to speak even more precisely than that, the values that underlie it, which is independent of, any manifestation of a given economic system. And I think there is something uniquely American that was exported that might be that Puritan, hardworking spirit, or maybe the frontier ethos. Nietzsche ties it to what he calls the American lust for gold, which Kaufman says could be a reference to the gold rush of 1849, though I think Nietzsche is correct that in a general sense that Americans do lust for gold, and this is not tied to any one period or event in history. But he says this haste in life, this economic way of living that creates this momentary fixation on the momentary, will throttle all culture and good taste. And, just to compare this to the previous passage of how the church harmed selfishness by associating it with the bad conscience, the thinkers harmed stupidity by associating it with the bad conscience. Here we're seeing leisure has been associated with the bad conscience. People make excuses when they engage in leisure, when they're not doing anything productive, whereas in previous ages they had to make excuses when they were doing something productive, if it was something that was beneath their station. And so there's this focus on conscience throughout, and particularly on the bad conscience and how it develops and the things that it can seize upon. And that will obviously become very important during in the genealogy of morality. And so we've talked quite a bit about really just the preamble to this passage, although I guess I've woven in commentary on many of the elements of it throughout, but just this connection between America and the culture of Europe, what's happening to the culture of Europe. You might ask, why does Nietzsche think America has this cultural power in the first place to make such a cultural export to smother Europe like a blanket in its values? Arguably, America is the place where the bourgeois culture comes fully into being. My friend Tony on One Dime Radio did a great interview. I can't remember the name of the guest, which is unfortunate, but they talked about the American Revolution as the fulfillment of the bourgeois culture. This was how many of the Marxists saw things, at least, and it's sort of like where the ideals of Adam Smith and so on come into their own. And this can happen in America. America is uniquely positioned to be the place where this happens because there are no previously established dynasties or political orders, historic homelands. It is quite literally, it's funny because there's so much controversy now over the notion that America is an idea. It was founded on an idea. Fundamentally, America was founded on an idea. And you may say that's a rather flimsy thing to found a nation state on, and I would agree with you, but that doesn't make it not true. It might be part of the nature of our very problems today, is when you base your nation state on an idea, people have different interpretations of ideas, and it becomes fertile ground for an ideological war. But that's getting ahead of ourselves, right? The thing is, much of what Nietzsche says in this passage is a very classical reaction to bourgeois society. It is very much, in a way, like almost the voice of the ancien regime against this rising sort of like mercantile power, pointing out that the way of life that's going to come with it is going to destroy culture, all the high and good things of culture. And so it's not that socialists are coming in and leveling mankind such that everyone has a little bit of leisure, but everyone must now share in the labor. That is certainly Nietzsche's critique of socialism in the passages where he talks about that. But what he's talking about here is rather that we are enslaving ourselves to this regime of productivity and work as an inherent good to our own detriment, or really to the detriment of the great tasks of mankind that do not lie with simply preserving ourselves, which we might say market forces are very good at doing. But insofar as will to power is the thing driving life, and we want to create something beyond ourselves, the themes of Zarathustra, it is to our detriment in that respect. If culture and the arts give us any pleasure now, Nietzsche says, it's like the small respite that a slave devises for himself. And that's certainly how art and culture are used as a method of recovering after you're exhausted after a hard day's work. And so the laborer just wants to turn off his brain when he gets his leisure time, probably wants to turn off his heart too, right? You can be challenged emotionally just as intellectually through art. And we're no longer able to let ourselves go. We're no longer able to just take no notice of the minute or the hour, let ourselves become absorbed in the moment without at least having a bad conscience over it or others judging us about it, right? Just to imagine just you laze away the hours in an intimate conversation, just have a long lunch and take a longer walk afterwards. Imagine just having moments or even long stretches without a care for the momentary. That's not really, quote unquote, permitted any longer by the modern morality. We've given it a bad conscience. We're not being forced to live this way. We're forcing it on ourselves. And actually, one of my favorite things about this passage is the way that Nietzsche talks about people sort of stretching out as long and wide and ungainly as one happens to be. It's just the mental image of somebody like sprawled out on the couch after their day at the Amazon warehouse or whatever. And then he says the other thing, the feeling that they might miss out on something. And we have that modern idea of FOMO, fear of missing out. That's what a modern idea, right? And so, or what a modern feeling that's like the sting of conscience, right? That, I have to go out, I have to go to this party, I have to go to this thing, I have to go make connections, I have to, like even our recreation time in many ways can still be a form of work, which is very sad. And a lot of it is driven by that sting of conscience that you'll be missing out otherwise. And so, yeah, this value system has succeeded in making us feel as though something's wrong when we're not being productive. And by the way, I don't think it's totally conquered the West. I think that there are some places in the West where otium survives. Italy is certainly one of them. Maybe perhaps Spain to some extent, but you'll notice none of those places are economic powerhouses, and they often have social problems, or like not social problems in the sense of like social unrest, but inefficiencies and flaws in like the really basic infrastructure of society sometime. But I won't go into that any longer. So that was a very long exegesis of that passage, but I think there was quite a lot there to consider. That was very important. Let's do 330. Quote, applause. A thinker needs no applause and clapping of hands if only he is assured of his own hand clapping. Without that, he cannot do. Are there people who can dispense with that also, and altogether with every kind of applause? I doubt it. Even about the wisest of men, Tacitus, who did not slander the wise, said, and I'm going to translate from the Latin here, quote, even for the wise, the lust for fame is the desire they give up last, end quote. Which with him means never, end quote. So Nietzsche writes quite a bit on vanity in Human All Too Human. Remember, he was influenced by La Rochefoucauld, who said that self-love was the driving motivation behind many of our apparent virtues. So Nietzsche has thought quite a bit about vanity, and one of its forms is fame, the desire to see one's worth validated through the approval of others. And now Nietzsche says in this passage, a thinker needs no applause, at least not from others, only his own. So this returns us to the theme of thought as really individual, irreducibly individual, at least insofar as you have to be able to think for yourself in order to really think at all, or else you're just again, reproducing the societal consensus, or you're just like absorbing the thoughts of others. That's not really what's signified by the act of thinking. But Nietzsche says whether it's for ourselves or for others, we might say whether we crave fame or act out of pure La Rochefoucauldian self-love, it seems we can't easily dispense with that. And as Tacitus says, the lust for fame is the last to fade, and Nietzsche says, and it really means it never fades. So just an observation about human nature here. But there is an aspect of unveiling the hidden motives driving the thinker, the fact that the will to truth is an accessory will. That's sort of a subtext of this aphorism. If indeed the primary motivation is applause, whatever that might mean, then if that's the last thing that the thinker would ever give up, then where does the will to truth fit into this? Nietzsche would sort of expand on this later in Beyond Good and Evil, insofar as he would say there that thinking is not an autonomous, disinterested activity, but a motivated, interested activity. Again, he says much of this throughout this book too, but he makes it, I think, much more explicit. It's a theme that comes to the forefront there at the very beginning of the book, whereas here he kind of explores it and circles back to it many times as sort of like a background issue, like it is here. Because, at least ostensibly this passage is about fame and the craving for fame and the relation of thinking to self-love, but even that means that there's something driving thinking that is not, that again, as Deleuze would say, thought does not think by itself. So let's go to 331, quote, "Better deaf than deafened. Formerly one wished to acquire fame and be spoken of. Now that is no longer enough because the market has grown too large. Nothing less than screaming will do. As a consequence, even good voices scream till they are hoarse, and the best goods are offered by cracked voices. Without the screaming of those who want to sell, and without hoarseness, there is no longer any genius. This is surely an evil age for a thinker. He has to learn how to find his silence between two noises and to pretend to be deaf until he really becomes deaf. Until he has learned this, to be sure, he runs the risk of perishing of impatience and headaches." End quote. So, I've said this so many times, but it would be so easy to see the gay science as just a bunch of randomly arranged aphorisms, but there is such an elegant and subtle pattern to the way these are, or like course of development for how these thoughts move. I mean, one of the first things, as a comment on the section, 2 sections before this, on leisure, when I brought up Nietzsche's disparagement of newspapers, we can only imagine what he would think of how people take in the news today, right? It's not enough to get the morning and evening paper, but you have to be able to have news up to the minute beamed to you by satellite. So it's not just like reading the paper at lunch, as he describes, but at all hours of the day, basically. It doesn't just come in the form of articles that one at least has to read and process and interpret for themselves. It comes in the form of video and TikToks and this bombardment to the senses. And Nietzsche would have just absolutely hated it. And so, and a lot of that concerned the sort of like economic value system that fixes us on the moment. And here he talks about the screaming of those who want to sell. We sort of imagine a series of barkers in the marketplace, shouting for attention. As Nietzsche says, it's an evil age for a thinker because he has to go and become one of these barkers in the marketplace in order to acquire any sort of purchase at all in the society. See, the metaphor that I just used, that just came to mind, purchase, an economic metaphor for thoughts and ideas. And so he says the market is so saturated today, to be heard, you can't just speak, you have to scream. And I think he would be even more horrified by today's world in which there's just the greatest oversaturation of people's thoughts offered up for you on every possible topic. Every subject imaginable, every hour of every day, people are uploading more of their thoughts in the form of, YouTube videos and podcasts and Substacks and vlogs and tweets. In some ways, it's a golden age of content. It's a golden age of sharing our thoughts, but it's certainly oversaturated. And you do certainly feel in this game of getting attention, getting clicks, getting eyeballs, that you have to, quote unquote, scream in order to be heard. And the interesting thing regarding Nietzsche is that this is the language that Jung used in order to describe Nietzsche's writing, particularly the over-the-top style of Zarathustra. He says that no one heard Nietzsche, they didn't comprehend him, so he felt he had to shout, to speak louder and louder in order to be heard. In other words, stylistically speaking, according to Jung, Zarathustra comes off a little strong at times. He may have gone too far in a few places. But it's interesting, what Nietzsche says we basically have to do in this evil age is learn to find our silence between two noises and to pretend to become deaf until we really become deaf. So it's not just an issue that the thinker can't acquire fame anymore without screaming. It's that there is all these other voices screaming, and again, that this is going to impress or inculcate the thoughts that they're trying to share to the world onto you. So you have to also have this sort of monk-like determination and focus not to let all of these other thoughts into your head. So let's go to 332. Quote, "The evil hour. Every philosopher has probably had an evil hour when he thought, what do I matter if one does not accept my bad arguments too? And then some mischievous little bird flew past him and twittered, what do you matter? What do you matter?" End quote. So we were just speaking about the evil age that we live in, if you're a thinker, a philosopher. And the philosopher could have an evil hour, and the things that Nietzsche says about this evil hour are in some ways like a microcosmic version of what he was just saying about the state of the marketplace of ideas, as we might call it. So what does he mean here by the evil hour? Philosophy, as it has been up to this point, at least as far as Nietzsche is concerned, has been this presumptuous activity of plucking down eternal truths from the lap of being, discovering the truth, which exists independently of the mind that thinks it, and there the philosopher himself is not really important any more than the scientific mind that discovers something, discovers a scientific truth. Within our analytic perspective, it's true because it's true, and not because so-and-so discovered it, right? Even if he's a great man, even if he's a great scientist, it's not that we just start believing uncritically what a certain scientist has to say, what Niels Bohr has to say, because he was right a bunch of times, right? That doesn't follow at all. And so oftentimes when we encounter a philosopher whose truths have been thoroughly absorbed and accepted, right, by the mainstream, their philosophy begins to look rather unremarkable. I'm thinking, for one example, of Spinoza's political treatise, which was radical at the time, but rather unremarkable in the present day. It's a little outdated. Much of what Spinoza advocates for would be accepted by many people as just like common sense. So what does the philosopher matter then, right? If every philosopher wishes to achieve fame, to achieve wide purchase of their ideas on the marketplace, and what the eventual result of that is that you become unimportant because everyone treats your ideas as foregone conclusions that are obvious to everybody, then what does the philosopher matter? Well, the philosopher then would only matter if we were to incorporate his bad ideas, his irrationality, his personality, his drives. If we were to incorporate that into his philosophy in the way that Nietzsche does, to suggest that his thought is not this activity of discovering philosophical facts, but confessing himself. But would the philosophers of past ages thought this way? I mean, Nietzsche says that this revelation is an evil hour. What do I matter unless people accept my bad arguments too? What do I matter unless they are interested in my work, not as a font of truth, but as an expression of my perspective? If you were coming from that older view of philosophy, the way Kant or Plato might have thought about it, then that would be a rather evil thought to think that. And of course, right after this schadenfreude little bird, it's translated as mischievous, but the bird is enjoying some schadenfreude, an enjoyment of a small suffering. He comes by and says, in this evil hour, indeed, what do you matter? And here we might think of Voltaire's statement that no philosopher has even changed the habit of the street that he lived on, that we might seriously question to what extent dialectics and logical arguments and all the philosophical treatises in the world have actually been like a driving force of history. Nietzsche certainly does not weigh in on that here, but it's certainly, if we bring this to our mind as a doubt a philosopher might have and take it seriously in that sense, like, what am I really doing? Am I actually being effective in the world? Yeah, we can imagine that is a very, that would be a very tormenting thought, or it has the potential to be. And again, much of this book is a record of impulses and how they translate themselves into thought. And we can imagine that Nietzsche himself has had similar thoughts. But it's interesting that he effectively attempts to redefine philosophy in such a way that his own bad arguments can become valuable, because in a perspectivist outlook they are, which is very funny. So I just brought up Spinoza, and Nietzsche begins his next aphorism by discussing him. This is 333. Quote, "The meaning of knowing, non redere, non lugere, neque detestare sed intelligere," says Spinoza, as simply and sublimely as is his wont. End quote. Let me translate that for you very quickly. Not to laugh, not to lament, nor to detest, but to understand. End quote. Back to the text. Yet, in the last analysis, what else is this intelligere than the form in which we come to feel the other three at once? One result of the different and mutually opposed desires to laugh, lament, and curse. Before knowledge is possible, each of these instincts must first have presented its one-sided view of the thing or event. After this comes the fight of these one-sided views, and occasionally this results in a mean. One grows calm, one finds all three sides right, and there is a kind of justice and a contract. For by virtue of justice and a contract, all these instincts can maintain their existence and assert their rights against each other. Since only the last scenes of reconciliation and the final accounting at the end of this long process rise to our consciousness, we suppose that intelligere must be something conciliatory, just, and good, something that stands essentially opposed to the instincts, while it is actually nothing but a certain behavior of the instincts toward one another. For the longest time, conscious thought was considered thought itself. Only now does the truth dawn on us that by far the greatest part of our spirit's activity remains unconscious and unfelt. But I suppose that these instincts, which are here contending against one another, understand very well how to make themselves felt by and how to hurt one another. This may well be the source of that sudden and violent exhaustion that afflicts all thinkers. It is the exhaustion on a battlefield. Indeed, there may be occasions of concealed heroism in our warring depths, but certainly nothing divine that eternally rests in itself, as Spinoza supposed. Conscious thinking, especially that of the philosopher, is the least vigorous and therefore also the relatively mildest and calmest form of thinking, and thus precisely philosophers are most apt to be led astray about the nature of knowledge. End quote. So, I would call to mind again that Deleuzian interpretation that thought does not think by itself. Thought is appropriated by some impulse. This is an incredibly important passage, by the way, and it's one that's almost never quoted from, or, there's one line in it that sometimes is quoted, but I think that it's just so key to understanding so many things about the way Nietzsche thinks about the interrelationship between impulses and thought. And here Nietzsche, in a way, he just is repeating the description already given in Daybreak, that conscious thought is not an active force, and it's not a unified force. It's not as though the intellect is an arbitrator that forces the competing drives and their one-sidedness to come to a reconciliation. Rather, the inner economy of the self is always forcing these contests and reconciliations that are going on beneath the surface of consciousness. And to the extent that these reconciliations are successful, we continue to cohere as an intelligible self, as a unity. The dynamic here is similar to the way that the ego consciousness construes its ability to represent multiple outcomes or choices to itself, represent them to itself. This is transmuted as evidence of the ability to act arbitrarily. And so here, the analogy, or I guess I'm drawing, or like the similarity in this dynamic that I'm trying to point out, the consciousness experiences itself as a coherence, as a reconciliation between drives, between desire and lamenting and laughing, for example. And it reinterprets itself as the cause of that coherence rather than as its effect, which would be similar to, again, representing to yourself all of the different possibilities, those phantasms of what could have happened or what can happen in the future, and seeing and weighing all those options as if the consciousness is the cause of what choice you make, when in fact the consciousness and the story it tells is the effect of the contest of the impulses that makes the choice. And so the language that Nietzsche uses here, he says, it is the justice within the self, the attacks and the requitals and the treaties, the contracts that occur between competing impulses. That's what produces the coherence. And the consciousness, or thinking, represents the story as to how we rationally produce that coherence. Why does Nietzsche invoke Spinoza, aside from using his phrase as something to critique, to give a different picture of thought? Well, Spinoza believed that freedom, as he understood it, could be attained by relinquishing the sad passions, fear and hope. Spinoza's mantra, as given here, is a kind of like liberation from the desires and expectations that cause us to suffer, by turning our mental activity solely to understanding. As he says here, not to laugh, not to lament, not to detest, but to understand. So if we comprehend, as Spinoza does, that all of the modifications of nature, all the beings that exist, act according to their own necessity, that they are like a thrown stone who has no say in whether it will continue to fly through the air, but nevertheless, if it were conscious, the stone would construe it as its choice to continue to fly through the air, even though it's absolutely a necessity and not a continued choice. But if the stone was conscious, it would be its choice. Well, that's the way that Spinoza sees us, and that's sort of our own delusion of free will. And if we realize that, paradoxically, we can attain freedom by becoming free of hope and fear, because we realize that our actions can't actually intercede into, we can't oppose the will of God. We can't oppose the plan of the all-powerful, all-knowing God. And so we simply trust in the divinity of nature, which Spinoza also believes very deeply in, even though he's often called a sort of atheist or a secret atheist, or that his pantheism is like the road to atheism. I think Spinoza was not trying to what might we say, lower the divine to the status of being merely nature. I think he was trying to elevate nature to the status of divinity. So, that's why Nietzsche has that line about how Spinoza, how does he say, something divine that eternally rests in itself. Well, all of us, we too are modifications of nature, modifications of God, modes of God's existence. And so knowing that, we can sort of trust in the overall goodness or justice of God's plan, or something like this, that might transcend any of our perspectival ideas of these things. But for Nietzsche, in a way, this all sort of points to Spinoza's mistake. He's attempting to separate thought from passion as a kind of salvation from it, when thought and passion are in fact intertwined. That he thinks by understanding what we really are, understanding that we are beings who live according to necessity, we can thereby become free of our passions, right? But Nietzsche would say no. I mean, that thought itself is not free from the passions, even from the sad passions. And we could say that our representations, those simulacra that the mind produces of what could have happened or what might happen, different ways we could have acted and so on, those conscious representations are intimately involved with fear and hope. It's almost difficult to imagine why a sentient being would have even the ability to represent alternative possibilities for the past or the future or their own actions if they didn't have the motivating, again, just to use Spinoza's language, passions of fear and hope. Otherwise, what's the point of planning for the future, trying to avoid certain outcomes or trying to bring certain outcomes forth, right? It's fear and hope you could just translate as a concern for the future. And fear and hope are, therefore, names for different experiences of the drives that give rise to thoughts, which are intimately related with our entire, perceiving and representing apparatus of the consciousness. In fact, as Nietzsche says in this passage, thought is, quote, a certain behavior of the instincts towards each other, end quote. What else does Nietzsche say here? That, quote, the greatest activity remains unconscious, end quote. Conscious thought was thought to be thought itself, right? Nietzsche will later argue that every drive has its own form of thought, that thought always corresponds to a drive, and vice versa. What begins as an impulse is eventually represented as a thought, presuming that that impulse triumphs to some degree. It could just be suppressed and never reach that stage. But so our thoughts are impulses that triumph, rise to the top after an interaction with all the other competing impulses. The great activity is unconscious because most of it never rises to the top. And that great activity, Nietzsche says, is war in so many words. There could be heroism involved, there could be peace treaties, but fundamentally he uses this warlike language. So within the inner intelligible content of nature and natural beings such as we, its modifications, as Spinoza would say, we don't find anything divine, as Spinoza believed. What we find is, Nietzsche calls it our warring depths, and therefore the sudden exhaustion or illness of a thinker, such as, for example, Spinoza, or perhaps Pascal, or perhaps Nietzsche himself, that could be seen as a battlefield exhaustion. You spent all your energies on this internal conflict, and then one day you're just burned out, right? So, it's a very interesting way of sort of like reimagining the whole inner panoply of experiences that actually do not rise to consciousness, of which we only have some sort of like signs and signifiers. We have to read the semiotic of our thoughts and impulses in order to have like a sort of an indirect notion of this. So it's a very important passage. And some sentences, again, the greater activity being unconscious, it's a very important sentence. And again, the way that conscious thought is irrevocably tied to impulse, in fact, a kind of product of a confluence of impulses, not something standing apart from them, certainly not above them. Let's move on to 334. Quote, one must learn to love. This is what happens to us in music. First, one has to learn to hear a figure in melody at all, to detect and distinguish it, to isolate it and delimit it as a separate life. Then it requires some exertion and goodwill to tolerate it in spite of its strangeness, to be patient with its appearance and expression, and kind-hearted about its oddity. Finally, there comes a moment when we are used to it, when we wait for it, when we sense that we should miss it if it were missing, and now it continues to compel and enchant us relentlessly until we have become its humble and enraptured lovers who desire nothing better from the world than it and only it. But this is what happens to us not only in music. That is how we have learned to love all things that we now love. In the end, we are always rewarded for our goodwill, our patience, fair-mindedness, and gentleness with what is strange. Gradually, it sheds its veil and turns out to be a new and indescribable beauty. That is its thanks for our hospitality. Even those who love themselves will have learned it in this way, for there is no other way. Love, too, has to be learned. End quote. I don't have as much of a comment on this one because I think it's fairly self-explanatory, even though it's a very deep thought that Nietzsche has. But I think you get it from just hearing that. And I've certainly discovered this about musical compositions myself. You rarely pick up on everything going on in a brilliant album or, on your first listen. And certainly if you dive into any classical music, you will hear many, 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 many layers because there's so many voices in the composition, right? It requires multiple experiences with the narrative of the music in order to discover its leitmotifs, and eventually there come to be musical passages that you anticipate, little shifts in mood as the melody repeats over differing chord progressions and so on, and eventually you come to crave these things, and you would miss them if they weren't there. Right? And Nietzsche relates this to learning to love other human beings, but really learning to love anything. It could be a city park, a book, a film, a building, a river, or even ourselves, we have to learn to love ourselves in this same way, because what Nietzsche says is, this is how what does he say? This is how we are always rewarded for fair-mindedness and gentleness with what is strange. So perhaps like the only really, what might we say, the hidden nuance or subtlety in this passage is the fact that we must learn to love ourselves. Are we strange? Are we strangers to ourselves? Are we another thing that we have to learn to love? Well, given that the great activity is unconscious, we certainly are. We certainly are strangers to ourselves. And I'm not going to elaborate on this anymore because it's actually a theme of the very next aphorism. And so we're going to move on to talk about that one, because this next section's a very long one. It's I just called it an aphorism. Again, it's force of habit. I know I've done that throughout, but it's not really an aphorism. It's almost like a short essay. But this is an incredibly important section. I've quoted from it before in the past, but never in full. So let's dive into this. This is one of my favorite sections in the entire book. 335, quote, "Long live physics. How many people know how to observe something? Of the few who do, how many observe themselves? Everybody is farthest away from himself. All who try the reins know this to their chagrin, and the maxim 'know thyself,' addressed to human beings by a god, is almost malicious. That the case of self-observation is indeed as desperate as that is attested best of all by the manner in which almost everybody talks about the essence of moral actions. This quick, eager, convinced, and garrulous manner with its expression, its smile, and its obliging ardor. One seems to have the wish to say to you, 'But my dear friend, precisely this is my specialty. You have directed your question to the one person who is entitled to answer you. As it happens, there is nothing about which I am as wise as about this. To come to the point, when a human being judges, this is right, and then infers, therefore it must be done, and then proceeds to do what he has thus recognized as right and designated as necessary, then the essence of his action is moral. But my friend, you are speaking of 3 actions instead of 1. When you judge, this is right, that is an action too. Might it not be possible that one could judge in a moral and in an immoral manner? Why do you consider this, precisely this, right? Because this is what my conscience tells me, and the voice of conscience is never immoral, for it alone determines what is to be moral. But why do you listen to the voice of your conscience? And what gives you the right to consider such a judgment true and infallible? For this faith, is there no conscience for that? Have you never heard of an intellectual conscience, a conscience behind your conscience? Your judgment, this is right, has a prehistory in your instincts, likes, dislikes, experiences, and lack of experiences. How did it originate there, you must ask? And then also, what is it that impels me to listen to it? You can listen to its commands like a good soldier who hears his officer's command, or like a woman who loves the man who commands, or like a flatterer and coward who is afraid of the commander, or like a dunderhead who obeys because no objection occurs to him. In short, there are 100 ways in which you can listen to your conscience. But that you take this or that judgment for the voice of conscience, in other words, that you feel something to be right, may be due to the fact that you have never thought much about yourself and simply have accepted blindly that what you had been told ever since your childhood was right. Or it may be due to the fact that what you call your duty has up to this point brought you sustenance and honors, and you consider it right because it appears to you as your own condition of existence, and that you have a right to existence seems irrefutable to you. For all that, the firmness of your moral judgment could be evidence of your personal abjectness, of impersonality. Your moral strength might have its source in your stubbornness, or in your inability to envisage new ideals. And briefly, if you had thought more subtly, observed better, and learned more, you certainly would not go on calling this duty of yours and this conscience of yours duty and conscience. Your understanding of the manner in which moral judgments have originated would spoil these grand words for you, just as other grand words like sin and salvation of the soul and redemption have been spoiled for you. And now, don't cite the categorical imperative, my friend. This term tickles my ear and makes me laugh despite your serious presence. It makes me think of the old Kant who had obtained the thing in itself by stealth, another very ridiculous thing, and was punished for this when the categorical imperative crept stealthily into his heart and led him astray, back to God, soul, freedom, and immortality, like a fox who loses his way and goes astray back into his cage. Yet it had been his strength and cleverness that had broken open the cage. What, you admire the categorical imperative within you? This firmness of your so-called moral judgment, this unconditional feeling that here everyone must judge as I do. Rather, admire your selfishness at this point, and the blindness, pettiness, and frugality of your selfishness. For it is selfish to experience one's own judgment as a universal law, and this selfishness is blind, petty, and frugal, because it betrays that you have not yet discovered yourself, nor created for yourself an ideal of your own, your very own. For that could never be somebody else's, and much less of all. Anyone who still judges, in this case everybody would have to act like this, has not yet taken 5 steps towards self-knowledge. Otherwise, he would know that there neither are nor can be actions that are the same, that every action that has ever been done was done in an altogether unique and irretrievable way, and that this will be equally true of every future action, that all regulations about actions relate only to their coarse exterior, even the most inward and subtle regulations of all morality so far, that these regulations may lead to some semblance of sameness, but really only to some semblance, that as one contemplates or looks back upon any action at all, it is and remains impenetrable, that our opinions about good and noble and great can never be proved true by our actions, because every action is unknowable, that our opinions, valuations, and tables of what is good certainly belong among the most powerful levers in the involved mechanism of our actions, but that in any particular case the law of their mechanism is indemonstrable. Let us therefore limit ourselves to the purification of our opinions and valuations, and to the creation of our own new tables of what is good. And let us stop brooding about the moral values of our actions. Yes, my friends, regarding all the moral chatter of some about others, it is time to feel nauseous. Sitting in moral judgment should offend our taste. Let us leave such chatter and such bad taste to those who have nothing else to do but drag the past a few steps further through time, and who never live in the present, which is to say the many, the great majority. We, however, want to become those we are, human beings who are new, unique, incomparable, who give themselves laws, who create themselves. To that end, we must become the best learners and discoverers of everything that is lawful and necessary in the world. We must become physicists in order to be able to be creators in this sense, while hitherto all valuations and ideals have been based on ignorance of physics or were constructed so as to contradict it. Therefore, long live physics, and even more so that which compels us to turn to physics, our honesty." End quote. So, long live physics. This might seem like a bit of a strange declaration at the end of a short essay that's about morality and psychology and human action. But as Kaufmann argues, and I agree with him, Nietzsche is using physics in this context in a broad, extended sense, in the same sense in which he commences this book with his declaration to see as beautiful what is necessary in everything. And indeed, he uses the same language in this passage of wanting to discover everything that is lawful and necessary in the world. And so the way to square the circle, I think, is to consider how Nietzsche's view of the self, his psychological analysis of the self, ultimately hinges on a view of the human being as physiological, and to the extent that we are physiological beings, not simply quote-unquote rational beings, who we are, our moods, our thoughts, moral determinations, can be understood through the lens of physics. Remember how Nietzsche spoke of attempting to find the right climate, the right altitude, the right air pressure for his well-being in Ecce Homo. So what is apparently external to you affects and is intimately related with what is internal. And that external world, climate, altitude, air pressure, is physics. We understand all of those things through physics. Another implication I think is important here is that physics is raised here, I think, in an implicit way in opposition to metaphysics. That, Nietzsche specifically invokes Kant in this passage, the categorical imperative. That's the moral theory of Immanuel Kant, but Kant's morality is in some sense inseparable from his metaphysics, and from his perspective of truth, we might say, truth is something unchanging. It transcends the phenomenal world. Kant's morality corresponds to such a metaphysical position insofar as his morality produces a universalist view, moral claims that apprehend over all rational agents, because after all, these moral claims are truth claims, and truths have to be acknowledged as true independently of the one expounding them, independently of any of these concerns of perspective or relativism. We believe in our theoretical worldview that everyone who thinks rationally has to accept this truth. And likewise, Nietzsche characterizes the Kantian moral orientation as everyone in this case must act like this. And he says anyone who thinks this way hasn't taken 5 steps towards self-knowledge. So again, this passage is a continuation of the previous one in that we must learn to love. What is learning to love? It involves discovery, in a sense, of getting into the nooks, into the intricacies and subtleties of something that was strange. And Nietzsche says this includes even ourselves. And he says at the very beginning, we're farthest from ourselves. Another key element of this passage, therefore, which relates all of this, the main theme of the beginning of the passage is conscience. And we've talked quite a bit about Nietzsche's view of conscience and his distrust of the conscience as being an unreliable source, or at the very least as a source that we have to be skeptical towards, that we have to question. This has been a theme underlying a lot of this book, but here he makes it very explicit. We say, my conscience tells me this, and it's never immoral. And how could we make such a claim? Because the conscience is the very standard by which we determine whether something is moral. When we hear a moral theory proposed, we check it not against our reason, but against our conscience. Or rather, if we do analyze it rationally, the final judge for most of us is conscience. But why? Why do we trust our conscience? Nietzsche raises the counter possibility of an intellectual conscience, a devotion in some sense to rationality over feeling as a means of judging moral claims. And that may seem strange too, given that Nietzsche is usually placed on the other side of that dichotomy as the thinker of feelings over facts. And indeed, Nietzsche points out that there is no disinterested form of thinking, a form of thinking that's not colored by feeling or by drive. There's no fact apart from its interpretation. But I think this is not too hard to disentangle, given the tension that Nietzsche will later present in Beyond Good and Evil, between truth as a danger and untruth as necessary for life. The thinker as a type who tests himself by proceeding as far as he can into the dangerous territory of truth, and not because he wishes to impart this truth to others as a universal way of life. He recognizes the indispensability of values for mankind, the fact that too much truth would cause mankind to perish, and yet the thinker is willing to subject himself to that perishing. It's that warlike ethos infusing itself into philosophy that Nietzsche hoped for in the section Preparatory Men. To put this by way of analogy, we fully acknowledge that the battlefield is not conducive to life or whatever, but also that that's the place where victories are won, right? If you wish to win victories, if you wish to win truths over to your side, you have to risk your life, quote unquote, in the metaphorical sense. Risk your own vitality, which is probably better served by believing an invigorating untruth. But one who lives without those risks is never going to win anything for himself. He will simply, again, reproduce the consensus within his mind, reproduce the existing tablets of values. As Nietzsche says, knowing the inner workings of your conscience could, quote, spoil these grand words for you, end quote. What are those words? Words like duty and conscience and moral strength. Perhaps we need such grand words in order to justify ourselves, to feel the sun shining on our way of life and our actions. So it could be quite dangerous to spoil them. And there's that funny bit about Kant being the fox that was clever and strong enough to break out of his cage, but then goes right back into it because he says, you've already been freed from all of these other words, these religious terms for understanding human action and sin and redemption and so on and so forth. But, as it's often said about Kant, he breaks out of the religiously ordained duties and obligations only to give us rationally ordained duties and obligations that happen to perfectly mirror all the previous religious ones. And so that's really the meaning of all of that. So in any case, to circle back, so we conduct this investigation following an intellectual conscience rather than the ordinary conscience. Because after all, the ordinary conscience has been shaped by countless factors, by physics, drives from inside, forces and factors from outside. And what do we discover? That the meaning of an action or a belief is not itself predetermined. That people listen to their conscience, for example, for a variety of reasons. They obey their conscience in a variety of ways. What the event of yielding to conscience signifies is not a universal truth or a universal, it's not some sort of event that can be universalized or universally understood. It could be an act of stubbornness. It could be an act of cowardice. It could be an act of bravery or love or stupidity. That's the other recurring theme of the gay science. Yet again, we cannot trust that because we've assigned a word to something, to an action or an event, that we know what the action or event means, because now it has a word, right? Fundamentally, every action is unique and it's unparalleled. And yet many human beings wish to be categorized. They want to have their actions and their way of life classified according to the existing schema. The great majority brood over, quote, the moral value of their actions. And morality is what? The herd instinct in the individual. The desire to fit themselves into the table of valuations that already exists. Nietzsche's concern in this passage, however, is not so much with the revaluation of those values, at least not the later form it will take in his work, that project on the grand scale, but with self-knowledge. He hasn't quite come to the idea of the revaluation yet. To the extent that it exists in his thought, it's in the terms that he would later use, saying that the free spirit is already in and of himself a revaluation of values. So that's why Nietzsche says at the end, he's writing to those who wish to become who we are, those who do not concern ourselves with calculating the value of our actions according to the existing tables, the existing accounting tables of morality, but those who feel ourselves to be unique and incomparable, who give ourselves laws, who author laws ourselves, the idea of self-legislature. And thus, the through line of this passage, long live physics, from the beginning to the end could be understood in these terms. It's the dictum inscribed at the temple of Delphi, know thyself, or that line of Heraclitus, I sought myself. Well, each man is farthest from himself. It is a thing that has to be sought. It is a thing that you have to become. Also, later in the preface to the genealogy, Nietzsche will say, the man of knowledge is particularly far from himself, precisely because his knowledge, his intellect, his consciousness, that represents itself as his identity in some sense, even more strongly than it does for the common person, and that leads to that sense of separation between thought and drive. Whereas Nietzsche suggests that if we observe ourselves, if we learn to observe ourselves, so there's that scientific language again, we will discover that the two are the same. There is no thinking without drive, no drive without thinking. And that means that, quote, who we are cannot be understood without physics, because it is at bottom a physiological question. And the final point I'd like to make in light of this concerns where Nietzsche says that all who find a categorical imperative in themselves, a drive to say, quote, all must behave as I do, ought to, quote, admire your selfishness at this point, and the blindness, pettiness, and frugality of your selfishness, for it is selfish to experience one's own judgment as a universal law, end quote. So recognize in your universalist moralizing the ascendance of a tyrannical impulse which has become master, and like all drives who want to become master, wishes to impose itself not just on you but on the broader world. And you should admire the intensity behind the belief. This is true self-knowledge, something approaching an understanding of oneself, to understand that there's an intensity behind the intention, behind the moral value you've attributed to it, an impulsive intensity. And it's interesting, again, because we started out talking about how selfishness has been given a bad conscience by the moralists, and here Nietzsche's saying it's selfishness that's precisely at the root of morality, insofar as it's all universalizing morality, all dogmatism is a selfish, tyrannical drive, which, again, you might think it paradoxical, but as he says in Beyond Good and Evil, perhaps all of the virtues of mankind emerged out of vices as their soil. And so we have to become physicists in order to become creators. And that should be reminiscent of the passage in Zarathustra, that to esteem is to create. Creation, therefore, involves the understanding that valuation itself is a creative force. To rank order what is best, second best, or second worst, and so on, that in itself is an act of creation, the creation of a new tablet. And so how will we become those who author our own laws? By becoming physicists, by understanding how such laws are written within the language of the impulses. Wonderful passage. It's, again, one of my favorites. Let's go to 336. Quote, nature's stinginess. Why has nature been so stingy with human beings that it did not allow them to shine, one more, one less, each according to the plenitude of his own light? Why are great human beings not as beautifully visible in their rise and setting as the sun? How much more unambiguous that would make all life among men. End quote. This is another passage I don't have much of a comment for, because I think it's mostly there in the face of it. He's just saying, why can't the brightest souls actually shine more brightly? Why is it that those with the most life in them perhaps don't always appear that way? Why is there so much ambiguity in human life and action? And I guess to the extent that I have a brief comment, I think Heidegger's conception of phenomenology is helpful here. The point is not to posit a disembodied truth behind appearances. That's not what he's doing in phenomenology. It's to suggest that the phenomenon is precisely what is not perceived and understood at face value. It has to be uncovered, has to be investigated. But overall, I think this is just sort of a poetic lament from Nietzsche that comes from a rather interesting place, because, again, he's very much subscribed to the search for knowledge and discovery and understanding all of the lawful necessities of things. And the perhaps sad fact of the matter is that those necessities and the laws, when it comes to human beings, are so often hidden or ambiguous. And that is just how things go. Let's go to 337. Quote, the humaneness of the future. When I contemplate the present age with the eyes of some remote age, I can find nothing more remarkable in present-day humanity than its distinctive virtue and disease, which goes by the name of the historical sense. This is the beginning of something altogether new and strange in history. If this seed should be given a few centuries and more, it might ultimately become a marvelous growth with an equally marvelous scent that might make our old earth more agreeable to live on. We of the present day are only just beginning to form the chain of a very powerful future feeling, link for link. We hardly know what we are doing. It almost seems to us as if it were not a matter of a new feeling, but rather a decrease in all old feelings. The historical sense is still so poor and cold, and many people are attacked by it as by a frost, and made still poorer and colder. To others, it appears as a sign of stealthily approaching old age, and they see our planet as a melancholy invalid who wants to forget his present condition and therefore writes the history of his youth. This is actually one color of this new feeling. Anyone who manages to experience the history of humanity as a whole, as his own history, will feel in an enormously generalized way all the grief of an invalid who thinks of health, of an old man who thinks of the dreams of his youth, of a lover deprived of his beloved, of the martyr whose ideal is perishing, of the hero on the evening after a battle that has decided nothing but brought with him wounds and the loss of his friend. But if one could endure, this immense sum of grief of all kinds, while yet being the hero who, as the second day of battle breaks, welcomes the dawn and his fortune, being a person whose horizon encompasses thousands of years past and future, being the heir of all the nobility of all past spirit, an heir with a sense of obligation, the most aristocratic of old nobles, and at the same time the first of a new nobility, the like of which no age has yet seen or dreamed of, if one could burden one's soul with all of this, the oldest, the newest, losses, hopes, conquests, and the victories of humanity, if one could finally contain all this in one soul and crowd it into a single feeling, this would surely have to result in a happiness that humanity has not known so far. The happiness of a God full of power and love, full of tears and laughter, a happiness that, like the sun in the evening, continually bestows its inexhaustible riches, pouring them into the sea, feeling richest as the sun does, only when even the poorest fisherman is still rowing with golden oars. This godlike feeling would then be called humaneness. End quote. What a beautiful passage, but it's another one where, at first glance, Nietzsche's philosophy may seem to contradict itself, as he has earlier in the Middle Period suggested that a lack of historical sense may be the congenital defect of philosophers. In other words, think of the terms in which he criticized Kant a few passages ago, a few passages ago, where Kant thinks his truths to be eternal things. He thinks that he can determine truths for all ages, independently of context and perspective and so on. And Nietzsche will later characterize the Platonists this way and all dogmatists as those who deny perspective, which he says turns truth on her head. And perspective is shaped by, among other things, the historical moment. It's the recognition of the changing and developing nature of truth, that truth is in appearance and lives in appearance. And what is appearance? It's flux, ultimately. So how can Nietzsche call the historical sense a disease in this passage? I think the best point of comparison to this section in The Gay Science is the essay on the use and abuse of history for life, in which Nietzsche argues that we have replaced education, real education, with historical education. And to the Greek, he says we would appear to be badly educated, or perhaps not educated at all. Like we would find the Greeks to be uneducated because they're very historically uneducated, whereas they would look at us as uneducated because all we have is a historical education. We're more like a walking encyclopedia than real human beings. We're stuffed to the brim with trivial facts that are never integrated into life. Nietzsche begins to level these critiques as part of his break with philology and the prejudices of philologists as a discipline. I think Burckhardt's framing was definitely influential on the young Nietzsche. It's very helpful to consider here that the Greeks were not humane men or forerunners of the Enlightenment, but violent and irrational people. And yet, as Burckhardt said, we see with the eyes of the Greeks and use their phrases as we speak. And Nietzsche would later ask, what is Hellenic about our Hellenists? What is classical about our classicists? How can they purport to teach us about the Greeks if they live in a completely opposite manner from the pagan Greeks? In other words, we are quite expert in the modern age at assimilating knowledge that in no way changes us, and Nietzsche felt that a particularly virulent manifestation of this intellectual disease was in our historical education. This constitutes one of the abuses of history, as he calls it. And it's just a great irony that the philologist, though, with his disgusting erudition, as Nietzsche calls it, like his whole mode of life, right? The way that he lives, which is part and parcel of the teaching that the philologist will give the students about ancient Greece, right? He learns about them through books, through erudition, through gathering up all these facts. But that very way of life is precisely the opposite of the way the ancient Greeks lived. So how does he really understand anything about them? And so that's the abuse of history that's going on here. But furthermore, in this passage, there seems to be a dig at romanticism in a sense, because there is, which there certainly might be involved from the very start with Nietzsche's critique of philology, because there's this way of like escaping into the past, of looking upon the past the way an old man writes the history of his own youth, right? So insofar as one understands all of this world history as my history, as a kind of personal inheritance, then one sees that all of these beautiful and good things in history, all of these stories of heroism and great men and fascinating ages from the past and other ways of life and achievements and all of these things, and all of that's in the past now. And Nietzsche's already said in a couple, or I believe just in the previous aphorism of, wanting to just drag the past along forever. Well, Nietzsche's philosophy is aimed at the future. And there's something that's can very much weigh you down about thinking that everything, that there was all of this amazing things about, humanity. It's all history. It's all something that's dead and gone or something like that. We might think of Emerson's statement that, that the church, or basically the interpretations of the gospel, speak of the God who walked on earth, was incarnated as a man, and all the miracles he did, and all of these amazing things as something long gone and long past, as though God were dead. That, by viewing the gospels as purely a historical event and perhaps not an imminent teaching for the here and now, it deprives those stories of their vitality. And again, the Greek myths were seen as something that were not historical events in the same way, that, the mystery of, the turning of the seasons and life and death and rebirth is contained in the story of like Demeter and Persephone and her journey to Hades. That is reenacted. That quote unquote happens again on a yearly basis with every reenactment of the mysteries, with every revelation of the mystery in the ritual context. So it's like a living truth that is re-experienced again and again and again. And there's something about making the Gospels historical, which is which deprives them of their vigor, their vitality, of the lifeblood in those Gospels. And, here we might think of Strauss and Nietzsche's critique against him in another untimely meditation. That's precisely what Strauss did, was try to recreate Jesus as a purely historical figure. And, that was obviously opposed by very many Christians, but we can see here why Nietzsche might also have his problems with Strauss's approach, because Strauss also sort of thought that, he's one of those types that Nietzsche would say just carried on the Christian morality while getting rid of all of the supernatural elements of it, which are, in fact, like the salvific elements, the elements that give those values, like the divine sanction, that make them appear as the thing of the highest meaning. So anyway, we don't need to get too far into the weeds with that. So Nietzsche calls the historical sense a disease, even though it's the virtue of our age, even though in other places he says sort of what is needful for the philosopher is precisely a historical sense. How do we square this circle? Well, I think this passage itself, if we read between the lines, does a good job of it, because in a way he's portraying the historical sense as something that is at present only the seed of what could become a marvelous growth in the future. That right now the historical sense represents not so much a new feeling, but the weakness and decline of all feeling, right? What is the possibility he presents for the future? That one could somehow take in this overwhelming knowledge of history, this immense grief and heroism and love and all of these things from all ages, endure all of this and overcome it in order to compress all of that nobility of the past into a single feeling. And so currently, the historical sense is a signifier for a lack of feeling. It's a disease in that sense. It's a form of exhaustion, decline. What if the historical sense could instead be compressed into that single ruling feeling? We might say, that the circumstance of the present constitutes the abuse of history. The future that Nietzsche imagines would constitute its proper use. History could become appropriated by a powerful drive. And this ties in with the passage, Long Live Physics. If we wish to become creators, we have to become physicists. We have to understand the interrelationship between thought and drive, between inside and outside, in order to create new values. That understanding reveals to us that even our categorical imperatives are just a compression of a very strong feeling, and therefore for history to become invigorating, life-promoting, species-promoting, it must become appropriated by such a strong feeling. It can't be abused as a retreat into a lack of feeling, an escape from the crushing weight of modernity into a romantic age. And that was part of Nietzsche's problem with Burckhardt, why he always suspected that Burckhardt held different convictions than the ones he publicly expressed, because Burckhardt himself viewed history as a source of reflection, as a series of representations in the Schopenhauerian sense, that one could meditate upon as a kind of reprieve from the suffering of the world. And furthermore, you could see within history the truth that all events and characters are just repetitions of the same fundamental story of the will. And that truth leads to resignation. It declaws your desire to become active, or to make history rather than simply study it. And so, in spite of Nietzsche's love of Burckhardt and his immense respect for him, he fundamentally disagreed with him on this view of history, which this was all the subject of the final episode of Season 5. And so, to recapitulate as regards this passage in The Gay Science, let's think once again of the preface from Beyond Good and Evil. Perhaps everything great and monumental in this world had to once bestride the earth in monstrous and frightening masks, as Nietzsche says. And he says dogmatic philosophy was such a mask. But the struggle against the dogmatists produces the most immense tension of the soul, and with such a tensely strained bow, we might now be able to aim for the furthest goals. So, he says, let us not be ungrateful to dogmatic philosophy. So history in the historical sense is perhaps similarly a promise for future ages, a promise that has to develop over thousands of years. It may now take the form of a disease in many cases, but suppose the struggle against this disease produces a similar tension of the soul. Perhaps this is the prelude to a real use for history that might one day come into being in the future. And the way Nietzsche describes the new state of mind that could be achieved is nothing short of divine, godlike. It almost seems like the transcendence of humanity. Ironically, he calls this godlike feeling by the name humaneness, and I think it's another sort of cheeky redefinition of humaneness, which again was often used during this time among the ranks of classicists to mean more or less what people mean when they invoke it today, when they invoke humanism. But they would use it to describe the Greeks, which Nietzsche thought was ridiculous. But this is Nietzsche's prophecy of like a new humanism, in which man will become something like a god, something that transcends the human. And the fact that he discusses this in relation to history and our use and abuse of it ought to call to mind the supra-historical individual, as Nietzsche describes him in that essay. And I'll quote, I found a paragraph from the final section that I think is really important to quote in relation to this passage here in The Gay Science, and think about it in relation. So this is from Use and Abuse of History for Life. Quote, "The antidotes to history are the unhistorical and the superhistorical. By the word unhistorical, I mean the power, the art of forgetting, and of drawing a limited horizon round oneself. I call the power superhistorical, which turns the eyes from the process of becoming to that which gives existence an eternal and stable character, to art and religion. Science sees in these powers contrary powers, for it considers only that view of things to be true and right, and therefore scientific, which regards something as finished and historical, not as continuing and eternal. Thus it lives in a deep antagonism towards the powers that make for eternity, art and religion, for it hates the forgetfulness that is the death of knowledge, and tries to remove all limitation of horizon and cast men into an infinite boundless sea whose waves are bright with the clear knowledge of becoming." End quote. Now again, Nietzsche, he always throws us for a loop, doesn't he? Because he goes on in that essay to say that science must always be watched as a kind of dangerous force. So we have to apply a kind of morality of hygiene to science in order to keep it from attacking life. For life without knowledge is possible, but knowledge without life is not possible. So knowledge depends on life, and it can't be allowed to undermine its own foundations. And so what are the antidotes to that tendency? The unhistorical and the suprahistorical. The unhistorical is the power to forget. We've done a whole episode on this concept, so go listen to that one if you want more on this. The superhistorical, however, reads almost as though it is the Goethean concept of the Urphänomen, the power to impose a unity onto existence, even if the limitations and boundaries of the phenomenon are not clear, if they blur into one another, as they always do. because all phenomena exist within a flux, and their seeming duration is but an illusion. So the antidote to science is art and religion, which has that power of perception of a unity, perhaps the symbolic unity, something like that. Is this view commensurate with Nietzsche's Gaia Scienza? Well, I would say yes, insofar as this is an experimental attempt to practice a kind of artful science. And that's perhaps the best statement of what that really means, right? The super-historical merging with the historical. Does Nietzsche necessarily succeed in this manner? That's up to you to determine. But I think we must think here of Nietzsche's note about stamping becoming with the character of being as the highest activity of the will to power. Science in its purity, like pure science, that will reveal to us only a clear and bright knowledge of the boundless sea of becoming, as he says. And as Nietzsche says in Birth of Tragedy, eventually, if we are cast onto this sea for long enough, we begin to yearn for a shore in the wide waste of the oceans of knowledge. To give an eternal and stable character to our existence, therefore, we have to look not to the power of science, which will never give us this, but to the power of art and religion. And so Nietzsche imagines a godlike kind of humaneness at the end of this passage, and we can only imagine that this kind of apotheosis of mankind into a new type of being who's capable of taking in the vast knowledge of history, which we might class as scientific insofar as it involves facts, dates, concrete events, and so on, and yet compressing all of this into a feeling. And what does that compressed feeling become? It becomes a ruling impulse of value. How does that value become imposed on the world? Through art and religion. And what does Nietzsche do in his next book? He creates an image of the Overman, a godlike being who transcends mankind. It's a bit of art, a bit of religion, to perhaps hasten along this marvelous growth of the historical sense, so that the historical sense can be given a meaning, a justification. It can prove to be a promise across millennia for a new way of living and being, a better way of living. Quote, the happiness of a God full of power and love, full of tears and laughter, a happiness like the sun in the evening continually bestows its inexhaustible riches. End quote. Beautiful Nietzschean prose. Let's move on to 338. Quote, the will to suffer and those who feel pity. Is it good for you yourselves to be above all full of pity? And is it good for those who suffer? But let us leave the first question unanswered for a moment. Our personal and profoundest suffering is incomprehensible and inaccessible to almost everyone. Here we remain hidden from our neighbor, even if we eat from one pot. But whenever people notice that we suffer, they interpret our suffering superficially. It is the very essence of the emotion of pity that it strips away from the suffering of others whatever is distinctively personal. Our benefactors are, more than our enemies, people who make our worth and will smaller. When people try to benefit someone in distress, the intellectual frivolity with which those moved by pity assume the role of fate is, for the most part, outrageous. One simply knows nothing of the whole inner sequence and intricacies that are distress for me or for you. The whole economy of my soul and the balance affected by distress, the way new springs and needs break open, the way in which old wounds are healing, the way whole periods of the past are shed. All such things that may be involved in distress are of no concern to our dear pitying friends. They wish to help, and have no thought of the personal necessity of distress, although terrors, deprivations, impoverishments, midnights, adventures, risks, and blunders are as necessary for me and for you as are their opposites. It never occurs to them that, to put it mystically, the path to one's own heaven always leads through the voluptuousness of one's own hell. No, the religion of pity, or the heart, commands them to help, and they believe that they have helped most when they have helped most quickly. If you who adhere to this religion have the same attitude towards yourselves that you have towards your fellow men, if you refuse to let your own suffering lie upon you even for an hour, and if you constantly try to prevent and forestall all possible distress way ahead of time, if you experience suffering and displeasure as evil, hateful, worthy of annihilation, and as a defect of existence, then it is clear that besides your religion of pity, you also harbor another religion in your heart that is perhaps the mother of the religion of pity, the religion of comfortableness. How little you know of human happiness, you comfortable and benevolent people, for happiness and unhappiness are sisters and even twins that grow up together, or as in your case, remain small together. But now back to the first question. How is it at all possible to keep to one's own way? Constantly some clamor or other calls us aside. Rarely does our eye behold anything that does not require us to drop our own preoccupation instantly to help. I know there are 100 decent and praiseworthy ways of losing my own way, and they are truly highly moral. Indeed, those who now preach the morality of pity even take the view that precisely this, and only this, is moral, to lose one's own way in order to come to the assistance of a neighbor. I know just as certainly that I only need to expose myself to the sight of some genuine distress, and I am lost. And if a suffering friend said to me, "Look, I am about to die, please promise to die with me," I should promise it. And the sight of a small mountain tribe fighting for its liberty would persuade me to offer it my hand and my life, if for good reasons I may choose for once two bad examples. All such arousing of pity and calling for help is secretly seductive, for our own way is too hard and demanding and too remote from the love and gratitude of others, and we do not really mind escaping from it, and from our very own conscience, to flee into the conscience of others, and into the lovely temple of the religion of pity. As soon as any war breaks out anywhere, there also breaks out precisely among the noblest people a pleasure that, to be sure, is kept secret. Rapturously, they throw themselves into the new danger of death, because the sacrifice for the fatherland seems to offer the long-desired permission to dodge their goal. War offers them a detour to suicide, but a detour with a good conscience. And while I shall keep silent about some points, I do not want to remain silent about my morality, which says to me, live in seclusion so that you can live for yourself. Live in ignorance about what seems most important to your age. Between yourself and today lay the skin of at least 3 centuries. And the clamor of today, the noise of wars and revolutions, should be a mere murmur for you. You will also wish to help, but only those whose distress you understand entirely, because they share with you one suffering and one hope, your friends, and only in the manner in which you help yourself. I want to make them bolder, more persevering, simpler, gayer. I want to teach them what is understood by so few today, least of all by these preachers of pity, to share not suffering, but joy." End quote. Probably the best summary of Nietzsche's position on pity, because even though I'm going to contextualize it as regards Nietzsche's broader project, it's perfectly self-contained. It's a perfectly nice, self-contained explanation of the problem of pity from Nietzsche's point of view. Pity, as we translate it, is in German, Mitleid, suffering with. And that's very important to remember. When we pity someone, we suffer with them. Their suffering causes us to suffer, and we accordingly wish to relieve that suffering, and perhaps with relieving their suffering, we will relieve our own. But Nietzsche raises a number of points against this. For one, what do we really know of the suffering of others? We see the surface of it, but we don't know its depths. The great activity is unconscious. We don't know the intricacies of how they suffer, how new needs spring into being, old wounds are healing as new ones break open, and so on. The way that we suffer is always part of an entire economy of the soul. And as Nietzsche has consistently held, it's not consciously communicable. We can only communicate what is common, what rises to the surface. And perhaps we could say that the way that we suffer is one of the most unique and incomparable things about us, what causes us to suffer, because it speaks again to the deepest desires and fears and hopes. So to what extent does our pity misunderstand others? That's a very important question. But perhaps even more importantly, the path to one's heaven might necessarily pass through the most voluptuous hell, as Nietzsche says, which refers us back to Nietzsche's assertion that pain is a means and not a measure of existence. Just as pleasure is also a means, it's not the end for existence. And pleasure and pain go hand in hand, as he says they're twins here. It could be argued that pleasure exists precisely at the moment of overcoming what is painful. Like, without the struggle, without the overcoming, what would be left of pleasure? Why then do we wish to even rid our fellow men of their pain, which it may in fact be what is absolutely needful for them? And Nietzsche is certainly speaking from experience here, in that he felt his sicknesses were worth it, quote unquote, for him. Because in overcoming them and convalescing, he feels he reaches an even higher experience of health than was possible for him beforehand. But suppose that pity really is as worthless as these meditations would suggest. Why then do we feel pity? Why is there a will to feel pity? And Nietzsche believes that it comes primarily from the religion of comfortableness. In other words, the values which underlie Christianity, the religion of pity, are not aimed at the elevation of mankind. They're aimed at keeping mankind as it is. Same old story. The herd instinct maintains the status quo, maintains the current rule, and so on. And now we have an understanding of why this is so motivating. Because of the pain of change and transformation. Pain is involved in overcoming. And therefore the herd morality fights against this, because at bottom it's a valuation that comfort is the highest goal. And here in this description we have the last man, he who thinks we have invented happiness, who asks, what is longing? What is a star? What is a goal for mankind? They can't even conceive of these things because such conceptions, they lead the mind toward the pain of overcoming, and that violates the religion of comfort, the invented happiness of the current moral regime. And so they wish for all of us to remain small together. And so Nietzsche has asked two questions. Is it good for the pitied to be pitied? The answer is no. Second, is it good for the one who pities? And to answer this, we have to refer back to Nietzsche's earlier aphorism, in which he suggested that there was a real allure to joining with the collective. In that letter, in which he says that his philosophy totters after an hour of sincere conversation and communion with others, that what pity does is redirect us back to the collective morality, in which the goal is that Hegelian mutual recognition. Nietzsche doesn't mention Hegel, of course, but that's the ready-to-hand example of what those who preach pity are looking to create. And this serves as a real seduction. It's a real temptation, as Nietzsche presents it. We can tell he really feels that temptation. And I think this is why that, that Turin horse story really, the story of Nietzsche hugging the horse really has stuck around for so long, because he pretty much admits here, it's a real seduction for me to give in to pity, right? So, and he says, even the noblest souls among us, when a war breaks out, see a secret path to suicide with a good conscience. That will be glorified as a death, in the name of the fatherland, but it is in fact an opportunity to dodge their duties with a good conscience, something like that. So, there's a real pleasure in becoming an instrument of the common good, of sacrificing yourself for the common good. And this leads us away from living for ourselves, that hard and unforgiving path. Nietzsche says, we do not really mind escaping from it. But what is good for us? Nietzsche doesn't provide an ironclad logical refutation of the value of pitilessness. He simply says that for us, we wish not to share in suffering, but in joy. So if pity is suffering with, Nietzsche says he wishes to raise up people who are bolder, who are more joyous, who could perhaps experience something like joy with. We don't have a word for it. To the extent that we become entangled with the experiences and feelings of others, it ought to be those of our friends, people like us, free spirits, those with whom we can come to an understanding, and above all, those with whom we can share our joys. So he cautions us, live by yourself and for yourself. See all the tumult of wars and revolutions and everything current as a mere clamor, even a murmur. Live in seclusion and willful ignorance. That's how you preserve yourself from pity. So is it good for the one who pities? Well, perhaps it's good for the herd animal, but is it good for us? Once again, thought itself is hemmed in and limited and neutered by the moral instincts. So if we're really, if we're going to fulfill our task as philosophers of the future, we have to actively safeguard ourselves against those instincts. And it's another reason why Nietzsche advocates solitude, because so many of these things are so hard to escape when you're in the crowd. Let's go to 339, quote, Vita femina. For seeing the ultimate beauties of a work, no knowledge or goodwill is sufficient. This requires the rarest of lucky accidents. The clouds that veil these peaks have to lift for once so that we see them glowing in the sun. Not only do we have to stand in precisely the right spot in order to see this, but the unveiling must have been accomplished by our own soul because it needed some external expression and parable, as if it were a matter of having something to hold on to and retain control of itself. But it is so rare for all of this to coincide that I am inclined to believe that the highest peaks of everything good, whether it be a work, a deed, humanity, or nature, have so far remained concealed and veiled from the great majority, and even from the best human beings. But what does unveil itself for us unveils itself for us once only. The Greeks, to be sure, prayed everything beautiful twice and even 3 times. They implored the gods with good reason, for ungodly reality gives us the beautiful either not at all or once only. I mean to say that the world is overfull of beautiful things, but nevertheless poor, very poor when it comes to beautiful moments and unveilings of these things. But perhaps this is the most powerful magic of life. It is covered by a veil interwoven with gold, a veil of beautiful possibilities, sparkling with promise, resistance, bashfulness, mockery, pity, and seduction. Yes, life is a woman. End quote. So Nietzsche begins this one talking about what's required to see the ultimate beauty of a work of art, but by the end of the passage, he's writing about seeing the beauty of life itself, or rather life herself, because she's a woman, and she, like a woman, is hidden behind a veil. A veil, of course, conceals something without concealing everything. It gives a hint of the beauty while still covering it over. And many of the things he says at the end is sort of the, what does he say? Sparkling with promise, resistance, bashfulness, mockery, pity, and seduction. Yes, life as a woman. So, again, you set your gender ideology aside for this passage. Nietzsche's speaking in very poetic terms. Think about it like a poem. Somebody talking about life as though it were a lover or a woman that they wanted to be a suitor to. Remember his aphorism from the beginning of Book 2, The Veiled Image of Sais, which is a reference to the poem about a veiled goddess. So in that section, the goddess is a metaphor for something more like truth rather than life. But there's a remarkable similarity into or how Nietzsche is describing life in this passage with the way he talks about the goddess in that one. And so in that section, Nietzsche writes, quote, "That cloud there, what is real in it? Subtract the phantasm and every human contribution from it, my sober friends, if you can," end quote. And further, Nietzsche addresses those who think themselves realists and says, quote, "As if reality stood unveiled to you only, and you yourselves were perhaps the best part of it," end quote. So there's an element of ourselves in every perception, every determination about reality that even comes down to the level of sense perception. We're not strictly talking about interpretation here. What of that cloud, that phenomenon, would remain apart from the eye to see it? And this isn't just to say our perception creates reality, man. I mean, there's a very practical reality to this insofar as the size and shape of the cloud, its position in the sky. That depends on your perspective, like literally your perspective, how close or far you are, whether we stand in the low fields of the high mountains, whether you can look down on the high mountains, down onto the clouds below, right? Which could be a very different perception than seeing them up above you. There's all of these aspects of any scene that can frame our perspective of it. And so as Nietzsche says in this passage, it's not just a matter of what we bring to the object in terms of like our subjectivity or something like that. It's a matter of the whole play of chance. We have to stand precisely in the right spot, as he says. The unveiling of the beauty of anything has to be accomplished by our own soul, but he also calls it's like the rarest and lucky of accidents. And so the highest peaks of everything good, as Nietzsche calls them, have yet to be discovered because it's a very rare chance occurrence to discover the truth or the beauty or the overall value of things in this great chaotic royal of phenomena, such that we should not expect it to be commonly unveiled. Put another way, Nietzsche has made it clear throughout the book that it's not there's no direct link between like the objective facts, quote unquote, or the concrete reality, quote unquote, that determines how we feel or what it like signifies or means to us, but the moral understanding or the philosophical understanding that we bring to it. In other words, in what light do we cast ourselves and our age and our surroundings? Do we view things through stained glass or in dreary, cloudy, overcast light or kind of half light? Do we view life from on a height or from a frog perspective? And so this also ties back in with learning to love. That's why it's required to learn to love, to learn to see what's beautiful and what is necessary in things. Nietzsche is still very much subscribed, it seems, to the justification of life by means of aesthetics, to justify life by making it beautiful, but one must learn to see this beauty. And it's by no means a regime of rote learning. It's learning by attempting, by experiment once again, because it's only through these fortuitous circumstances, by luck, that we glimpse the goddess named life behind her veil and those high, elevated moments. And a final note would be the invocation of seeing things once and how the Greeks would pray for everything beautiful twice and even 3 times. Well, on the one hand, this is simply another way of stating the fortuitous nature of truly unveiling the beauty of life for yourself or the beauty of anything. But also we might think of, the notion, or it's a popular idiom, popular saying, you only live once, right? You only get to experience this one time. You only get one chance at it. And yet the Greeks would pray 2 times, 3 times more, something like that. And we might think of the difference between seeing life as something only lived once versus something that could be lived 2, 3, or perhaps even innumerable times more. And we'll discuss this more a couple of sections later after this one. Actually, just 2 more sections until we get to that one. Okay, let's go to another. There's an incredibly important one between here and that one, however. I've quoted from it many times. This is number 340, quote, "The dying Socrates. I admire the courage and wisdom of Socrates and everything he did, said, and did not say. This mocking and enamored monster and Pied Piper of Athens, who made the most overweening youths tremble and sob, was not only the wisest chatterer of all time, he was equally great in silence. I wish he had remained taciturn also at the last moment of his life. In that case, he might belong to a still higher order of spirits. Whether it was death or the poison or piety or malice, something loosened his tongue at that moment, and he said, 'O Crito, I owe Asclepius a rooster.' This ridiculous and terrible last word means, for those who have ears, 'O Crito, life is a disease.' Is it possible that a man like him, who had lived cheerfully and like a soldier in the sight of everyone, should have been a pessimist? He had merely kept a cheerful mien while concealing all his life long his ultimate judgment, his inmost feeling. Socrates suffered life. And then he still revenged himself with this veiled, gruesome, pious, and blasphemous saying. Did a Socrates need such revenge? Did his overrich virtue lack an ounce of magnanimity? Alas, my friends, we must overcome even the Greeks." End quote. We've already analyzed this passage on the podcast in the past, as I've said, but let's now consider it in its context. First, the context of Nietzsche's career, and then next in the context of this book. For one, we have to remember what Nietzsche said about Socrates in The Birth of Tragedy. Why is it that Socrates is the great enemy of tragedy, from whom tragedy perishes? Why does tragedy die from the Socratism of morality? Why does the late Attic comedy represent a refutation of the tragic spirit? Fundamentally, it's because the theoretical worldview, which comes into being with Socrates, is optimistic. It confines the individual to that limited sphere of solvable problems, the key word being solvable. Socrates sees the possibility for a happy life, eudaimonia. It is achieved through reason, through virtue, which are interrelated. But the faith of Socrates is fundamentally that the virtuous man is the happy man. In fact, that's one of the key points that he wishes to argue in the Dialogue of the Republic. It's the key point that he argues against Thrasymachus, who claims that the unjust man is the happiest. That means that the tragic art form, which suggests that the suffering of existence is inevitable. Even for the virtuous hero, it's inevitable. Suffering can come senselessly and without meaning. Fate may have wicked things in store for us. The noble man can be profoundly unhappy. All of that is a false claim to be refuted. It's a false view of life, just like the various falsehoods of the poets and playwrights throughout Greek history that leads Socrates to criticize them. But here Nietzsche seems to have almost like a revelation about Socrates. At his dying hour, Socrates says, in Nietzsche's understanding, life is a long sickness. And this is perhaps his greatest problem with Socrates, his martyrdom for the sake of the truth, elevating the truth above life. More than that, sacrificing life at truth's altar. Because if you were to owe a rooster to Asclepius, the god of medicine, you're thanking that god. That's something you do as a sacrificial offering in thanks, in gratitude, in thanksgiving to the deity for whatever that deity has done in his domain that's been of benefit to you. So the god of medicine, if he heals you, you sacrifice a rooster. So the god of medicine is healing me. He's telling Crito, I owe a cock to Asclepius, a rooster. Please take care of that for me after I die. Which seems to suggest that life is a kind of disease and death is a cure. And, many have interpreted the death of Socrates as an optimistic act of truth triumphing, even in the face of oppression or irrationality or something like that. But the trouble for Nietzsche involves his final words, right? Remember, what's signified by an action is never predetermined. And even here, Nietzsche says, who knows what loosened his tongue? It was death or the poison, anything. Who knows what it was that caused this? The problem was that he spoke these words that then assigned it a meaning. That this physical world is not worth so much. Perhaps the metaphysical reward for the virtuous life is a thing to look forward to. And that's why Nietzsche wishes he could have just perished without speaking at all, without speaking these last words. He admires him in everything he said, did, and did not say, which again hints at a greater affinity with Socrates than is usually supposed. But we find that he wishes that perhaps that last category could have included a bit more, right? Perhaps he could have not said a bit more than he did. Or to say it a bit less awkwardly, perhaps he could have just said less. Left his death ambiguous in what it signifies. So why is this important? Well, because it suggests that Socrates was a pessimist, someone who judged life to be of little value when it comes to the critical moment. Which means what? What was the optimism then that Nietzsche perceived in the theoretical worldview? Was it a pose, a ruse? Was this one of Socrates' ironies? He's that great ironist of all ironists. Was it another irony? So does this revise Nietzsche's entire critique as given in Birth of Tragedy? I think it's no mistake that the second preface was written a couple of years after this work. Within, Nietzsche's affirmative philosophy, his mature philosophy is coming into being right here as we speak, at the end of this book, Book 4 of the Gay Science. And within that vigor of that period, he writes another preface to the Birth of Tragedy, sort of giving his interpretation of his earlier work now with some hindsight. And he makes it clear there that he thinks there's a difference between a pessimism of weakness and a pessimism of strength. A pessimism of weakness is obviously a pessimistic view of life, but one that devalues life. Whereas a pessimism of strength is a pessimistic view that nevertheless affirms life. So he sees the pessimism of strength as the original cultural view of the Greeks, and we must understand this form of pessimism, this intellectual predilection for the hard and terrible aspects of existence, as a form of life affirmation, which is itself hard and terrible. So in other words, the life affirmation that comes out of a pessimism of strength is tested time and again. It's tempered, we might say, in one's own inner struggle, within the warring depths, as Nietzsche says. Whereas optimism, it seems, is a kind of flight from reality. If one affirms life through optimism, they do so by positing an ideal that they believe may one day be reached. An ideal state or an ideal republic that could be achieved. An ideal way of life, an ideal set of morals. Optimism, in other words, does not establish its affirmation of life based on what is. How could it do so? Life as it is, You'd have to be a fool to see it optimistically. The optimist establishes his view based on what could be. And when that optimism fails, we might say, the pessimism that comes flooding in is never the pessimism of strength. And why is that? Well, because it's a pessimism that's never been tested, so how could it be strong? Instead, it's a pessimism of last resort, a judgment that comes in a moment of crisis. It's a judgment that comes with the abandonment of one's old principles. And so Nietzsche compares the optimism of Socrates in that 1886 preface to Birth of Tragedy to the twinkling in the eyes of the dying hospital patient, the dim glow of the setting sun. It's a delusional optimism of the one who's dying, who fantasizes about a heavenly afterlife, or even deludes himself into thinking I'll get better any day now. That's the significance of the dying Socrates and how Nietzsche's view of him evolves. But what is the significance of this section then? Not just in regard to Nietzsche's whole career, but as regards this book. Well, Nietzsche's praised the Greeks throughout. He praised them in the previous section, which he said the Greeks wished for everything beautiful 2 or 3 times more, which is a sort of prefiguration, perhaps, of the eternal recurrence, wishing for everything once more, innumerable times more. The Greeks celebrated appearance. They lived in appearance. They loved life, but they were honest about what life was. Socrates is a very different kind of Greek. He signals a change from the older Hellenism to the younger, the later philosophy, which is moralizing and logicizing. These are the values of Greek society at the time of their decline. While Nietzsche is keen to draw that distinction between these two eras, I think it's worth remembering that they are ultimately 2 eras of the same culture. As Nietzsche says in Philosophy in the Tragic Age of the Greeks began philosophizing at the right time, but they did not end at the right time. That same driving spirit of curiosity, embodied by the philosopher who serves as a physician to culture during the healthy period, becomes a kind of sickness that grips the Greeks during their period of decline. And then the philosopher becomes a poison mixer to culture. And even Socrates himself contains a kind of greatness. I mean, Nietzsche has praised him too as, again, the one who gave the bad conscience to stupidity, stood as the individual against a decadent society. But his story ends on a tragic note, and he seems here to praise the salvation of death. And indeed, the example of Socrates then becomes an example of how to die well. And that's how he's remembered by, for example, the Stoics. And so, we must overcome even the Greeks. We must remember the total picture of their culture, where it started and where it ended, and we can see its microcosm in Socrates. However much we may admire him, he has to be overcome, just as the Greek culture must be overcome. We see in his dying hour that weakness, that corruption rise up and seize him. Again, all from Nietzsche's perspective. Socrates' death has been interpreted many ways. All right, let's move on to 341. Quote, "The greatest weight. What if some day or night a demon were to steal after you into your loneliest loneliness and say to you, 'This life as you now live it and have lived it, you will have to live once more and innumerable times more, and there will be nothing new in it. But every pain and every joy and every thought and sigh and everything unutterably small or great in your life will have to return to you, all in the same succession and sequence, even this spider and this moonlight between the trees, and even this moment and I myself. The eternal hourglass of existence is turned upside down again and again, and you with it, speck of dust. Would you not throw yourself down and gnash your teeth and curse the demon who spoke thus? Or have you once experienced a tremendous moment when you would have answered him, 'You are a god, and never have I heard anything more divine'? If this thought gained possession of you, it would change you as you are, or perhaps crush you. The question in each and everything, do you desire this once more and innumerable times more, would lie upon your actions as the greatest weight. Or how well disposed would you have to become to yourself and to life to crave nothing more fervently than this ultimate eternal confirmation and seal." End quote. We have also done multiple episodes on the Eternal Recurrence and on this aphorism, but this is its first proper appearance in Nietzsche's canon. Again, there's been like little subtle hints here and there that people have suggested lead to the eternal recurrence, but this is the first time that he states it explicitly. And it will be the last major idea we discuss in our read-through of Book 4. As I have already said a great deal about the eternal recurrence, I'm going to focus my commentary on the passage's meaning in its context, its appearance near the end of this book, which was originally the end of the entirety of the gay science. We have spent much of Book 4 concerning ourselves with this one thing that is needful for an individual to find satisfaction with himself, as Nietzsche says. And what does Nietzsche say would be the ultimate confirmation and seal of one's existence? To be able to say, yes, this, once more and innumerable times more. How well disposed to life would you have to be to crave this as that ultimate seal? And thus Nietzsche is providing us with a test. He will later use the eternal recurrence as a selective principle, as part of his project of the revaluation, but much of this book of the gay science has concerned the values of the individual, concerned our examination of our own moral justification for life, our own observation of ourselves, as physicists of the spirit, we might say, even our own vivisection, that is, an analysis of the self that might even be dangerous in some way. And here it all seems to culminate in a kind of test that you could put to yourself. That's why the passage is called the greatest weight, which in German means something like the heavy weight, also the heaviest category of boxer, right? As we say heavyweight boxer in English, it's the same usage in German. And therefore, while it could be interpreted as a weight in the sense of a burden to carry, it could also be seen as a kind of challenge. The eternal recurrence is the toughest possible challenge. That's how I have paraphrastically translated the title of that section into English. The challenge is presented in the form of another experiment. And I know I've criticized the term thought experiment as regarding this idea, but it's because of the connotations of the term thought experiment as something unimportant. You kind of pick it up, play with it, put it down again. It's like a game. It's not important, right? You can talk about the trolley problem all day long, but does it really correspond to reality? We always have to distill out these really abstract, unusual scenarios to supposedly learn things about people's moral intuitions that don't seem to actually play out in reality, those things we learn about their moral intuitions. And so, in any case, so I think we can take the term experiment more seriously, and it will be appropriate to see this as an experiment. Again, in the sense that, as Nietzsche says, all mankind could perish from his experiment with truth. So here, perhaps it's an experiment, but it's one by which you might perish. He says it could crush you. In any case, Nietzsche begins the passage with, what if, right? Or sometimes it's translated as suppose. Suppose some day or night that this happened. So this is not an argument, it's not an assertion, it's a possibility. Later, Nietzsche would attempt to prove the eternal return, but here he doesn't bother to do that. In context of this passage, what matters is to bring the possibility before your mind in order to determine what it would mean to you and to examine the feeling that you experience, the reaction that's produced when you subject yourself to this thought. Would you throw yourself down and gnash your teeth, or would you celebrate it and be grateful for it? In other words, the tenor of Book 4 has been existential throughout. Everything is oriented toward the individual thinker coming to an understanding of how his way of life can be justified. This passage is the crescendo. This is Nietzsche showing you the path to a confrontation, leading you down the road to the confrontation point with yourself. Have I done the one thing that is needful in life? Has my life been acceptable to me? Do I find it to be justified? Well, how would I know? Easy. Do you wish for your life once more and innumerable times more? That is the question. Whether you experience this as an abysmal thought or as the highest thought reveals yourself to yourself. And it forces that confrontation. And we could say that your past, to the extent that it's unchangeable, irreversible, because you can't change the past is a necessity, right? It's one of those lawful and necessary things in the world. Therefore, can you see what is beautiful and what is necessary as regards not the world, quote unquote, in some abstract encapsulation of all existence, But in your existence, in your self-same life, can you see as beautiful what is necessary in the irreversible past of your existence? In other words, the meaning of that declaration at the beginning of Book 4, the new mantra, Amor Fati, let that be my love henceforth, is revealed in its most beautiful and its most violent form in this, the penultimate section. Because this possibility, if it were taken to be a truth, could either crush you or ennoble you. But one thing is for certain, it would change you. It would make you other than you are. And so paradoxically, before and after confronting the eternal return, one is a different person, either one who sanctifies their life with an eternal seal, or one who cannot do this, and therefore probably will experience a kind of nausea or vertigo at this possibility, again, supposing he even takes it seriously. But nothing's changed in terms of those necessities, those irreversible truths. The only thing that's changed is your interpretation of it. We come to understand whether our experience of life has culminated in a judgment that life is good or life is bad. That's pretty much the simplest terms I can put it. We reveal our instincts to ourselves, and that knowledge will change you without changing anything. In fact, one who accepts it would have to accept that they have always been the same in some sense, which is the esoteric meaning of Nietzsche's words, become who you are. In other words, transform into what you are already. That's a paradox, obviously. There's a profound meaning within it. And we can only comprehend that meaning insofar as we have the experience, not just the thought, the experience of confronting the eternal return, forcing a judgment on your own life in light of that. Because to affirm it, one would both say yes to precisely the person they already are, and in the same breath, they would become something new. And since the eternal return places your life on this ever-repeating circuit, you would have to say you've already become who you are innumerable times. So again, nothing has changed. And this thought became so important to Nietzsche because of this intended effect. It is the highest and most powerful doctrine of Zarathustra. He's the prophet not only of the overman, but of the eternal recurrence. And oftentimes in the later books, he suggests that his role as the preacher of the return is his true and ultimate significance. And we've seen how, especially throughout the final book, Nietzsche has prefigured most of the powerful ideas of Zarathustra. The eternal recurrence is the final doctrine that has not yet appeared until this point. And it's the highest, most esoteric of his doctrines, whose implications are still yet to be fully understood. And thus, upon first indoctrinating us into this mystery in this aphorism here, the only thing that is left is to introduce his prophet, Zarathustra. He was the first figure in history to draw that sharp dichotomy between good and evil, and thus declared good and evil to be metaphysical essences, mutually exclusive and eternally at war. As such, Nietzsche says in Ecce Homo, Zarathustra had to be the first one to realize that this was a mistake, and he returns now after years of solitude to preach the opposite, a philosophy which is now beyond good and evil. Nietzsche has argued throughout for the need for solitude, to stand apart from the collective, to live for oneself and in seclusion. And yet the prophet of every such idea feels himself indispensable enough to declare, this is the kingdom of heaven on earth. And thus, he must go down from the mountainside and into the domain of man. But what could this be other than the beginning of a tragedy, given everything we've learned in this book? And thus the final passage is entitled Incipit Tragedia. The tragedy begins. Quote, when Zarathustra was 30 years old, he left his home and Lake Urmi and went into the mountains. There he enjoyed his spirit and his solitude, and for 10 years did not tire of that. But at last his heart changed, and one morning he rose with the dawn, stepped before the sun, and spoke to it thus, you great star, what would your happiness be if you did not have those for whom you shine? For 10 years you have climbed up to my cave. You would have become weary of your light and of the journey had it not been for me and my eagle and my serpent. But we waited for you every morning, took your overflow from you, and blessed you for it. Behold, I am sick of my wisdom, like a bee that has gathered too much honey. I need hands outstretched to receive it. I want to give away and distribute until the wise among men enjoy their folly once again, and the poor their riches. For that I must descend to the depths, as you do in the evening, when you go behind the sea and still bring light to the underworld, you over-rich star. Like you, I must go under, as men put it, to whom I wish to descend. Bless me then, you calm eye that can look without envy even upon an all too great happiness. Bless the cup that wants to overflow, in order that the water may flow from it golden and carry the reflection of your rapture everywhere. Behold, this cup wants to become empty again, and Zarathustra wants to become man again. Thus, Zarathustra began to go under. End quote. Signing off. If you enjoyed the Nietzsche podcast or found it helpful, you can visit us and support the show at patreon.com/untimelyreflections. The link is in the description. Or just share the show with any of your friends that you think might enjoy it or on social media. Thank you for your support.